The Zephyrian Empire had built its entire military doctrine around a simple premise. Warfare was an art form, and like all proper art, it required both technical mastery and aesthetic appreciation. Their battles were choreographed affairs, complete with ceremonial armor that gleamed like liquid starlight, weapons forged according to traditions older than most star systems, and combat techniques passed down through generations of warrior poets who viewed each engagement as an opportunity to demonstrate cultural superiority. It was, the Zephyrians believed, what separated truly advanced civilizations from the crude masses who populated the galaxy's outer reaches. Anyone could point weapons at each other and pull triggers that was mere violence. But to transform conflict into something approaching ballet, to make war itself an expression of higher philosophy, well, that required the sort of sophisticated thinking that only came with millennia of cultural refinement. The fact that this approach had resulted in the Zephyrian Empire conquering exactly 3 minor asteroid mining operations and 1 abandoned research station over the past century was, their military theorists insisted, entirely beside the point. Quality, after all, was far more important than quantity. Ambassador Corvash adjusted his ceremonial combat plumes as he reviewed the latest reports from the frontier territories. The Zephyrian expansion into what humans quaintly called their space was proceeding with characteristic elegance. No crude bombardments, no messy planetary invasions, just a series of carefully orchestrated diplomatic encounters designed to demonstrate Zephyrian cultural supremacy in ways that even primitive species could appreciate. Status report on the Kepler 186 Farads negotiations. Corvash commanded, his voice carrying that particular Zephyrian cadence that managed to sound both melodious and insufferably condescending. His aide, a younger diplomat whose plumes hadn't yet achieved full ceremonial complexity, consulted his data slate. The cultural exchange program is proceeding according to schedule, Ambassador. Commander Thexvor reports excellent progress in demonstrating proper combat techniques to the human observers. Corvash's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. The cultural exchange program was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Invite representatives from primitive species to observe Zephyrian military demonstrations. Let them witness the sheer aesthetic superiority of advanced combat techniques, and watch as they inevitably concluded that resistance was not merely futile but embarrassingly crude. The humans, being barely 3 centuries into spaceflight, were expected to prove particularly susceptible to this approach. Their military doctrine remained laughably primitive, all explosions and kinetic weapons, with no appreciation whatsoever for the artistic elements that elevated mere violence into something approaching civilization. Excellent, Corvash said, examining his reflection in the polished surface of his ceremonial blade. And the human representatives? How are they responding to the demonstrations? With appropriate awe, Ambassador. Their diplomatic translator has been taking extensive notes, and his offspring appears quite impressed by our combat rituals. The irony was delicious. While the humans were busy scribbling notes about Zephyrian combat superiority, the Empire's real expansion was proceeding through subtler channels, trade agreements that favored Zephyrian merchants, cultural programs that positioned human colonies as protectorates, and diplomatic frameworks that would eventually transform the entire sector into a Zephyrian sphere of influence. All without firing a single shot naturally. Violence was for primitives. Down on the surface of Kepler 186 Farads, Marcus Rivera was discovering that Zephyrian definitions of cultural exchange were somewhat more expansive than advertised. The trading post had been selected for the program precisely because it represented everything the Zephyrians found charmingly backward about human frontier settlements. A collection of prefabricated modules connected by covered walkways, populated by miners, traders, and the occasional diplomatic representative who had drawn the short straw for outer rim assignments. Marcus fell into the last category. His official title was Cultural Liaison Specialist, which in practice meant he translated alien complaints into bureaucratic language and tried to prevent minor incidents from escalating into major diplomatic crises. It was not, he often reflected, the sort of career path that attracted overachievers. But the position had one significant advantage. It allowed his 16-year-old daughter Luna to participate in various cultural exchange programs, exposing her to alien perspectives that would serve her well if she decided to pursue a career in interstellar relations. Luna was bright, curious, and possessed the sort of natural diplomatic instincts that Marcus had never quite managed to develop. Which was why, when Commander Thexvor's demonstration went sideways, Marcus found himself facing the sort of diplomatic crisis that no amount of bureaucratic language could solve. The incident occurred during what the Zephyrians termed a combat appreciation session. Commander Thexvor, resplendent in ceremonial armor that probably cost more than Marcus earned in 5 years, was demonstrating traditional Zephyrian blade techniques to a small group of human observers. The demonstration was, admittedly, impressive. Thexvor moved with fluid grace, his ceremonial sword tracing complex patterns through the air while he explained the philosophical underpinnings of each technique. The weapon itself was a work of art, curved blade forged from some exotic alloy that seemed to bend light around its edge, handle wrapped in materials that Marcus couldn't identify but suspected were probably worth more than the entire trading post. Luna watched from the front row, taking notes with the serious attention she brought to all her studies. She was, Marcus noted with parental pride, asking intelligent questions about the relationship between combat technique and cultural expression. That was when Thexvor decided to demonstrate the 17 movements of ascending enlightenment. The technique was, according to the commander's explanation, designed to showcase the perfect integration of physical prowess and spiritual discipline. Each movement built upon the previous one, creating an escalating display of technical mastery that culminated in a strike of such precision and beauty that opponents would often surrender rather than force the completion of the sequence. It was, Thexvor assured his audience, completely safe when performed by a properly trained practitioner. The first 16 movements were indeed spectacular. Thexvor's blade carved through the air in patterns that seemed to defy physics, creating momentary trails of ionized atmosphere that glowed with soft blue light. His movements were so fluid they appeared choreographed, and Marcus found himself genuinely impressed despite his general skepticism about alien posturing. The 17th movement, designed to demonstrate the ultimate expression of controlled violence, required a target. Thexvor selected what appeared to be a training dummy, positioned at the edge of the demonstration area. His final strike was indeed a thing of beauty, a perfectly executed diagonal cut that would have bisected the target with surgical precision. Unfortunately, Luna had moved to get a better view of the technique's execution. She was standing directly behind the training dummy when Thexvor's blade completed its arc. The exotic alloy didn't quite cut through Luna's left shoulder, but it came close enough to open a gash that immediately began bleeding with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested several important blood vessels had been compromised. Marcus was moving before his conscious mind fully processed what had happened. He reached Luna in 3 strides, caught her as she stumbled, and found himself staring at an injury that was definitely going to require medical attention and possibly surgical intervention. "Daddy?" Luna's voice was small and confused, the sort of tone she hadn't used since she was much younger. Marcus looked up at Commander Thexvor, who was examining his blade with the sort of clinical detachment one might apply to a malfunctioning piece of equipment. "Most unfortunate," the commander said, his voice carrying that same melodious condescension. The young human moved into the demonstration area at an inappropriate moment. Perhaps better instruction regarding proper observation protocols would prevent similar incidents. Marcus stared at him. "You're saying this is my daughter's fault?" "I am saying," Thexvor replied with infinite patience, "that proper appreciation of advanced combat techniques requires appropriate positioning and awareness. The responsibility for maintaining safe distances lies with the observers, not the demonstrator." Marcus carefully helped Luna to a nearby chair, applying pressure to her wound while his mind processed the full implications of what he'd just heard. The Zephyrian had injured his daughter through what was at best careless showboating, and was now suggesting that Luna was responsible for being in the way of his theatrical sword work. "Commander," Marcus said, his voice carefully level, "I think we need to discuss this incident through proper diplomatic channels." Thexvor's plumes shifted to a pattern that Marcus was learning to recognize as mild irritation. If you wish to file a formal complaint, the appropriate forms are available through standard bureaucratic processes. Though I should note that such complaints typically require extensive documentation and witness testimony, and the review process can take several months. Marcus nodded slowly. I see. I'm certain this minor incident can be resolved without unnecessary bureaucratic complications. Thexvor continued. Perhaps some additional cultural education would help the young human better appreciate the requirements of advanced civilization. Luna made a small sound of pain as Marcus adjusted the pressure on her wound. Blood was seeping through his fingers despite his efforts, and her face was growing pale. Commander, Marcus said, I need to get my daughter to medical facilities. Of course, the trading post's medical bay should be adequate for such a minor injury. Marcus helped Luna to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their way toward the settlement's medical center. Behind them, he could hear Thexvor resuming his demonstration for the remaining human observers, explaining how the unfortunate incident illustrated the importance of proper respect for advanced combat techniques. The trading post's medical bay was staffed by Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a former military medic who had retired to frontier medicine after deciding that patching up soldiers was less stressful than patching up miners. She took one look at Luna's shoulder and immediately began preparing surgical instruments. How did this happen? She asked, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned and examined the wound. Marcus explained the incident while Dr. Martinez worked. Luna, sedated and finally free from pain, dozed on the medical table as synthetic tissue regenerators slowly repaired the damage to her shoulder. She'll be fine, Dr. Martinez said finally. Full mobility should return within a week or two. But Marcus, this cut was dangerously close to the subclavian artery. A few millimeters in either direction, and we'd be looking at a very different conversation. Marcus stared at his sleeping daughter. Luna looked younger when she was unconscious, reminding him of the small child who used to fall asleep in his lap while he read diplomatic reports. The alien thinks it's her fault for being in the wrong place, he said. Dr. Martinez's expression hardened. The alien is an idiot. I've seen the security footage. Your daughter was in the designated observation area the entire time. That sword technique was just poorly planned showboating. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair next to Luna's bed. Thexvor suggested I file a formal complaint through diplomatic channels. How long would that take? Months. Maybe years if they decide to appeal through Zephyrian cultural courts. Doctor. Martinez finished sealing the surgical incision and began packing up her instruments. Marcus, I've been patching up people for 20 years, both military and civilian. In my experience, there are two kinds of problems in this universe, the kind you solve through paperwork, and the kind you solve by making it clear that certain behaviors have immediate and unpleasant consequences. Marcus looked up at her. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that sometimes diplomatic solutions aren't the right tool for the job. Doctor. Martinez paused in her cleanup. Did you know that Zephyrian culture places enormous emphasis on personal honor and individual combat prowess? That's what the cultural briefings say, yes. And did you know that their legal system includes provisions for resolving disputes through formal duels? Marcus frowned. I think I read something about that, but it's mostly ceremonial, isn't it? Reserved for major diplomatic incidents. Doctor. Martinez smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded Marcus that she had spent 15 years as a military medic. Marcus, your daughter was injured by an alien military officer who then blamed her for his carelessness. In most human cultures, that would constitute grounds for considerably more than a formal complaint. Marcus spent the next 3 hours researching Zephyrian dueling protocols through the trading post's diplomatic database. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. The Zephyrian Empire did indeed maintain an elaborate legal framework for resolving disputes through individual combat. The system was ancient, dating back to their pre-spaceflight civilization, and had been maintained primarily for ceremonial purposes and particularly serious diplomatic incidents. The protocols were exhaustively detailed, covering everything from weapon selection to arena specifications to post-combat legal ramifications. A formal challenge could be issued by any individual who felt their honor had been compromised by another party's actions. The challenged party could accept the duel, offer compensation in lieu of combat, or forfeit their position and accept public disgrace. Most importantly, the outcome of a properly conducted duel was legally binding across all Zephyrian territories and protectorates. Marcus read through the protocols twice, then activated the communication link to Ambassador Corvash. The Zephyrian diplomat appeared on the screen with his usual elaborate plumage and insufferable expression. "Mr. Rivera, I understand there was a minor incident during today's cultural demonstration. I trust the matter can be resolved without unnecessary complications." "Ambassador," Marcus said, "I'm calling to formally invoke Article 17 of the Zephyrian Honor Code." Corvash's plumes shifted through several patterns in rapid succession. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rivera, but I don't believe you understand the implications of what you're suggesting." "I understand perfectly, Ambassador. I'm challenging Commander Thexvor to individual combat under traditional Zephyrian law. He injured my daughter through carelessness and then blamed her for his mistake. That constitutes a challenge to family honor that can only be resolved through formal duel." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Corvash responded. "Mr. Rivera, with all due respect, you are a diplomatic translator, not a warrior. Commander Thexvor is a trained military officer with decades of combat experience and mastery of traditional weapons. Such a challenge would be inadvisable." Marcus smiled, and even he was surprised by how cold the expression felt. "Ambassador, are you suggesting that the Zephyrian Honor Code doesn't apply to humans?" "Of course not. But then I formally request that you convey my challenge to Commander Thexvor. Under Article 17, he has 72 hours to respond." Marcus terminated the connection before Corvash could offer additional objections. Dr. Martinez found him in the trading post's small gymnasium 3 hours later, methodically working through combat drills that he hadn't practiced in 15 years. "I didn't know you had military training," she said, watching as Marcus ran through a series of knife-fighting techniques. "Infantry, about 20 years ago. I did 2 tours in the Proxima conflict before deciding that diplomacy was a safer career path." Marcus completed the drill sequence and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Turns out I was wrong about the safety part." "Are you sure about this, Marcus? I've seen Zephyrian combat demonstrations. They're not just for show." Marcus glanced toward the medical bay where Luna was sleeping off the anesthesia. "Rebecca, someone hurt my daughter and then had the audacity to blame her for it. If I let that stand, what kind of message does that send to every other alien species that thinks humans are soft targets?" Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "What can I do to help? Tell me everything you know about Zephyrian physiology." Commander Thexvor received Marcus's challenge with the sort of amused condescension typically reserved for small children attempting to explain complex concepts to adults. "The human wishes to duel?" he asked Ambassador Corvash, his plumes arranged in patterns indicating barely contained laughter. Over such a trivial incident. I'm afraid the challenge is quite formal and properly submitted," Corvash replied. "Under Article 17, you are required to provide a response within the prescribed timeframe." Thexvor considered this. The human translator was, by all accounts, a minor bureaucrat whose most significant achievement was successfully processing cultural exchange paperwork. The idea that such an individual would challenge a trained Zephyrian warrior to combat was so absurd it barely warranted consideration. On the other hand, accepting the challenge would provide an excellent opportunity to demonstrate Zephyrian combat superiority to the assembled human observers. A quick, decisive victory would reinforce the appropriate hierarchy while providing educational value for the primitive species. "Very well," Thexvor said. "I accept the human's challenge. Standard dueling protocols, traditional weapons, tomorrow at dawn." "Excellent," Corvash said. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." This should provide an interesting conclusion to our cultural exchange program. Thex Vor spent the evening preparing his equipment with the sort of ceremonial attention that the occasion demanded. His dueling armor was a masterpiece of Zephyrian craftsmanship, overlapping plates of exotic alloys that provided excellent protection while maintaining the aesthetic elements essential to proper combat. His primary weapon was a curved blade forged according to techniques developed by master weaponsmiths over countless generations. The human, according to reports, was preparing with considerably less ceremony. He had selected basic protective gear from the trading post's emergency supplies and what appeared to be a standard military combat knife, crude but functional tools that suggested a refreshing lack of pretension. The duel was scheduled to take place in the trading post's central courtyard, with representatives from both species serving as witnesses. Ambassador Corvash would serve as the formal referee, ensuring that all protocols were properly observed. Marcus spent the night sitting next to Luna's bed, watching her sleep and trying to remember everything he'd learned about close-quarters combat during his infantry days. The techniques came back more easily than he'd expected. Muscle memory had a way of reasserting itself when circumstances demanded. Luna woke briefly around midnight, still groggy from the medication, but coherent enough to recognize her surroundings. "Daddy, what happened? You were hurt during the demonstration," Marcus said, taking her hand carefully. "But Dr. Martinez fixed you up. You're going to be fine." Luna blinked slowly, processing this information. "The Zephyrian? The one with the sword?" "Yes. It was an accident, wasn't it? He didn't mean to hurt me." Marcus looked at his daughter's pale face, at the bandages covering her shoulder, at the medical monitors tracking her vital signs. "Accidents happen, sweetheart. But how people respond to accidents says a lot about their character." "What do you mean?" Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." Dawn on Kepler 186 Farads arrived with the sort of gray, overcast light that seemed appropriate for formal violence. The trading post's central courtyard had been cleared and marked according to traditional Zephyrian dueling protocols, a circle 20 meters in diameter, with designated positions for combatants, referee, and witnesses. Commander Thexvor arrived in full ceremonial splendor, his armor gleaming like liquid metal in the morning light. His movements were fluid and confident, each step calculated to demonstrate the perfect integration of aesthetic and practical considerations. He carried his dueling blade with casual grace, occasionally executing brief technique demonstrations for the benefit of the assembled witnesses. Marcus arrived wearing basic protective gear and carrying a combat knife that had seen better days. He looked, several of the human witnesses thought, like someone who was trying very hard not to think about what he was about to do. Ambassador Corvash positioned himself at the edge of the dueling circle and began reciting the traditional pre-combat litany, a complex recitation of honor codes, historical precedents, and procedural requirements that lasted nearly 10 minutes. "The challenged party may offer compensation in lieu of combat," Corvash announced finally. "Commander Thexvor, do you wish to make such an offer?" Thexvor's plumes shifted to patterns, indicating mild amusement. "I offer my regrets for the unfortunate incident and my assurance that future demonstrations will include additional safety protocols." "Mr. Rivera, do you find this compensation acceptable?" Marcus looked across the circle at Thexvor, then glanced toward the medical bay where Luna was recovering. "No." "Very well. Combatants, take your positions." The formal duel began exactly as everyone expected. Thexvor moved with the fluid grace of centuries of Zephyrian martial tradition, his blade tracing elegant patterns through the air as he advanced with measured steps. His technique was flawless, his form perfect, his confidence absolute. Marcus, on the other hand, looked exactly like what he was, a middle-aged bureaucrat who was trying to remember combat skills he hadn't used in 2 decades. For the first 30 seconds, the duel proceeded according to Zephyrian expectations. Thexvor demonstrated superior reach, technique, and training, while Marcus awkwardly attempted to avoid being carved into diplomatic incident-sized pieces. Then Marcus stopped trying to fight like a Zephyrian and started fighting like a human. The transition happened so quickly that most of the alien witnesses missed it entirely. One moment Marcus was stumbling backward, apparently overwhelmed by Thexvor's superior skill. The next moment, he had grabbed a handful of the courtyard's decorative gravel and flung it directly into the commander's face. Thexvor's perfect form wavered as he blinked frantically, trying to clear grit from his eyes. In that moment of distraction, Marcus moved with the sort of ugly, practical efficiency that had kept him alive during 2 tours of infantry combat. The combat knife went into Thexvor's armpit, one of the few gaps in his elaborate armor, and found the cluster of major blood vessels that Dr. Martinez had helpfully identified during their anatomy discussion. Thexvor staggered backward, his perfect form collapsing into something considerably less elegant as he tried to process what had just happened. His ceremonial blade fell from nerveless fingers as he pressed both hands against the growing stain spreading across his armor. Marcus didn't give him time to recover. The second strike went under the helmet's lower edge, finding the spot where Dr. Martinez had explained that Zephyrian neck vertebrae were particularly vulnerable to lateral pressure. Commander Thexvor dropped to his knees, then fell forward onto the decorative gravel of the trading post's courtyard. His elaborate plumage spread around him like spilled paint, and his expensive armor clinked against the stone with a sound like wind chimes. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of morning wind through the settlement's connecting walkways. Marcus stood over Thexvor's body, still holding the bloody combat knife, and realized that every alien and human witness was staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to horror to something that might have been respect. Ambassador Corvash was the first to recover his composure. "The duel has been concluded according to traditional protocols," he announced, his voice carefully neutral. "The human has achieved victory through legitimate means." Marcus wiped the knife clean on Thexvor's ceremonial cloak and walked back toward the medical bay where Luna was waiting. "Doctor," Martinez met him at the entrance. "How do you feel?" Marcus looked back at the courtyard where Zephyrian witnesses were carefully examining Thexvor's body, while human observers watched with expressions of mixed fascination and unease. "Like a father whose daughter was threatened," he said finally. The aftermath of the duel spread through diplomatic channels, with the sort of efficiency that only truly shocking news could achieve. Within hours, reports were reaching governmental centers across human space and beyond, each transmission carrying the same basic message. A human civilian had killed a trained Zephyrian military officer in formal combat, using techniques that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The Zephyrian Empire's initial response was predictable outrage. Commander Thexvor had been defeated through trickery and barbarism, they argued, not through legitimate combat skills. The human had violated the spirit of honorable dueling by resorting to crude tactics that no civilized being would consider. The fact that Marcus had technically followed all required protocols while employing these tactics was, Zephyrian officials insisted, entirely beside the point. Human governmental response was more complex. Officially, they expressed regret for the unfortunate incident while noting that Marcus had acted within established legal frameworks. Unofficially, military analysts began revising their assessments of human combat capabilities and psychological profiles. Other galactic species watched the proceedings with intense interest. The humans, previously dismissed as primitive newcomers, had just demonstrated a willingness to employ violence in ways that more advanced civilizations found deeply unsettling. Marcus spent the days following the duel, completing the paperwork required to close the cultural exchange program and arrange transportation back to more civilized parts of human space. Luna recovered rapidly, showing the sort of resilience that teenagers brought to most physical challenges. "Daddy," she said during one of their conversations, "what's going to happen now?" Marcus looked out the window of their temporary quarters at the Zephyrian ships preparing to depart the system. "Now we go home. You finish your education, I go back to translating alien complaints, and hopefully we both forget this ever happened." "But what about the other aliens? Are they going to be angry?" Marcus considered this. "Some of them, yes. But they're also going to be more careful about how they treat humans in the future. Is that good or bad?" "That depends," Marcus said, "on whether you think fear is a better foundation for diplomatic relations than contempt." Luna thought about this for a moment. I think I'd rather be feared than ignored. Marcus smiled. That's my girl. The final irony of the incident became apparent only weeks later, as reports filtered in from across human space. Zephyrian cultural exchange programs were being quietly suspended throughout the sector. Trade negotiations that had previously favored alien merchants were being renegotiated with considerably more respect for human positions. And several species that had been considering expansion into human territory were suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the difference between civilized behavior and effective behavior. Unfortunately for Commander Thexvor, the lesson had been somewhat more expensive than anyone had anticipated. Ambassador Korvash, in his final report to the Zephyrian High Command, noted that future interactions with human populations should perhaps include additional consideration for their psychological characteristics and combat capabilities. The species appears to possess, he wrote, a regrettable tendency to respond to perceived threats with disproportionate and uncivilized violence. While this makes them unsuitable for cultural integration, it also suggests that alternative approaches to diplomacy may be advisable. The recommendation was approved unanimously, though several members of the High Command privately noted that it had taken the death of a decorated military officer to reach a conclusion that proper xenological research might have provided much more economically. Marcus Rivera returned to his position as Cultural Liaison Specialist with a significantly revised job description and a salary increase that reflected his new status as someone who had personally demonstrated human diplomatic capabilities in ways that other species found memorable. Luna resumed her studies with a new appreciation for the complexities of interstellar relations and a small scar on her shoulder that served as a permanent reminder that not all cultural exchanges concluded with handshakes and photo opportunities. And somewhere in the trading post's central courtyard, a small plaque marked the spot where Commander Thexvor had learned that humanity's approach to conflict resolution was considerably more pragmatic than their approach to cultural appreciation. The plaque's inscription was simple and direct. Here lies proof that parenting skills translate surprisingly well to interstellar diplomacy.